Armory decks are Flesh and Blood's single most important product, in my humble opinion, and I want to talk about them yet again. This is because I recently decided to try out the One Piece TCG, and after buying a couple starter decks for that game, I have a few things to say about the Armory decks in comparison. Because after buying these One Piece starters, I've come to realize a few things that I think LSS does better with the Armory decks, but also some things I think they do worse, and I want this video to be a bit of a dive into these things. But before I get to that, I want to take a moment to talk about just how important Armory decks are for growing the game. See, I've obviously been a diehard Flesh and Blood fan for years now, and it's been a while since I've even wanted to try out a new game, especially one with a big IP. But after finding a few old Magic cards and trading them into a new LGS in my town, I decided to give One Piece a go, and not only did I buy this purple-black Luffy deck, the next day I also went and picked up two of the Blackbeard decks, yes, two, and this has been my start to the One Piece TCG. I haven't bought any boxes or packs, just some starter decks to give the game a go, because honestly, I don't know if I'm even going to want to play a lot of One Piece. I just think it might be a fun side thing to play here and there. If I end up really liking it, I might dive into it more, but for now, I'm just starting with some basics and seeing how it goes. And this is why the Armory decks have been so important and successful. For years, all Flesh and Blood had were Blitz precons, and let's be honest, they weren't very strong. They were fine to learn the game maybe, but if you wanted to play Blitz at a locals, let alone Classic Constructed, you were forced to essentially build an entire deck or spend a lot upgrading the Blitz precons. But Armory decks? While not every one of them is a powerhouse, a lot of them are quite good out of the box and offer a very easy stepping stone into the game. This allows players to just pick one up and give the game a try with very minimal effort, and that is the most important part of getting people into a game. And this is why I care about Armory decks as much as I do. Sure, you'll have some competitive TCG players come from other games and just immediately build a top tier deck to take to a pro quest or whatever, but that's not going to be the majority of players. For most people, one of these is going to be their first real dive into the game. Sure, maybe they start by playing the welcome decks or the first strike decks, but let's be honest, those are just a taste of the game. If someone is genuinely wanting to try Fab and are looking for a product to buy, I don't think many people are recommending the first strike decks over the Armory decks. But while being the best and easiest onboarding product into the game is why I think these decks are so important, I do have some things to say about them in comparison to the precons from other games. So using One Piece as the main comparison, let's jump into what I think the Armory decks do better than precons from other games, and then I'll talk about what I think they do worse and what I think could be improved. Of course, if you disagree with me or have other ideas, please feel free to leave a comment. But with that, let's get to what Armory decks do better. So the very first and foremost thing that I think Armory decks do better than not just the One Piece starters, but those for other games as well, is the aesthetics of the packaging. First impressions are everything, and when you put these two boxes side by side, I mean, let's be real. The One Piece art definitely pops, but the box is just this oversized rectangle that looks pretty generic and uninspired. The Armory decks, on the other hand, not only have the hero pop as well, but the box itself is sleek and elegant with a lot of attention to detail. And this attention carries on to the back of these boxes, which admittedly is pretty irrelevant to customers since you'll always see the front instead. But still, when you turn the One Piece box over, you get this really ugly and boring wall of text. No art, no care or concern. It's just, here's the product contents, now go fuck yourself. The Armory decks, however, have a little bit of flavor about the hero with some eye-catching icons. There's just a bit more care and concern here, which if you're someone just jumping into Fab, has that positive effect of making you go, oh, okay, so the people who make this game care. But the single most important thing that LSS does infinitely better than most other games is the fact that you only need to buy one Armory deck. Every new card that is exclusive to the Armory decks comes as a playset, and this is the biggest W I can give LSS. Remember how I said I bought two Blackbeard decks for One Piece? Well, this is for two reasons. One, I couldn't find a second copy of the Luffy deck, and two, One Piece decks have two foil cards that only come as a 2 of. And of course, you want 4 of them. This means that I had to shell out another $25 for a second deck just to get 4 cards that are very much not worth $25. Not only do I feel a little cheated out of my money by this, but pretty much every other card in these decks comes as a full playset, meaning that I now have an entire deck's worth of useless garbage that I don't need. Now, to be fair, this isn't as bad as Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you need 3 whole ass decks just to get your playset, but still, Armory Decks coming with all of the copies of the new cards eliminates the need to buy a second or third copy. Sure, you can buy more for reprints like Call to the Grave if you want, but you don't have to buy more just to get the deck exclusive cards. And this is a very, very good thing because having to buy multiple decks sucks. I don't want the extra chaff that comes with getting a second deck, but for One Piece, if I wanted 4 copies, I was kind of forced to. Now, one other thing that I think Armory decks do really well is being very cohesive decks that don't feel like they're full of chaff the same way other decks for other games do. Now, to be fair to One Piece, these are starter decks, which are meant to be a bit simpler. Armory decks feel closer to what the Yu-Gi-Oh! Structure decks are, being a bit more playable out of the box, except again, for Yu-Gi-Oh! You have to buy 3 of them, keep the best cards, and throw out the rest. I genuinely do think that Armory decks are a very solid product, and the fact that you just need to buy the one to get all the deck exclusive cards is incredible. That said, there are a couple things that the One Piece and other TCG's decks do a bit better. If you watched some of my previous Armory deck reviews, then quite frankly, nothing I'm about to say is new at all. However, I want to reiterate the points I have made in the past using the One Piece decks as a direct example to really highlight why I think these things are important. And the first thing is, of course, a basic how to play guide. Now, we did get this with the Gravy Bones deck, and while I think it did a pretty decent job, the one that comes in the One Piece starter deck is exactly what I've been talking about all this time. The One Piece how to play guides are larger than the ones that come in the Gravy Bones deck and are far better structured. The top left corner starts with the game essentials and everything you need to play, differentiating the different types of cards. This then moves to the game preparation, showing the layout of the game and the steps you take before you start. After that, there's a very detailed turn flow section that breaks down the steps of the turn in order, with examples and explanations for each part of a turn beside them. Then, on the back, there's a layout of the board state to use as a playmat if you really want to. Even though I'd played a single game before buying the starter decks, I didn't remember all the rules, and having this to look over and reference while playing again was super useful. And the way that this is all laid out makes it very easy to find and understand what you are looking for. As for Armory decks, well, there's 2 points I want to make here. 1. Not all of the decks have a how to play guide. While Gravy Bones had one, the Ira deck didn't, although this might be because Ira could have been planned to release earlier and was moved to after Gravy Bones. We honestly don't know if this is the case, but this part could be fixed with the upcoming Pleiades, Rhinar, and Arachne decks. But the second and more important point I want to make is that while this how to play guide is a huge improvement over not having one, it's a little difficult to use. See, the front side is quite nice, showing what parts of your hero card are, what the symbols represent, and the layout of the game. But when you flip it over, it's just a wall of text. Now, I think LSS could go in 2 different directions here. First, they could keep their how to play guides simple like they are now, but make the sheet larger like the One Piece guides. Have examples of cards attacking, blocking, instants, and reactions. I personally find the paper playmats on the back of these things to be rather pointless considering, it's like shown right here on the guide itself. So you can use the space on both the front and the back to break down the rules and show how the game is played, not just with text, but actual visual card examples. The other thing they could do is what Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon do, or at least used to. I'm not sure if they still do, but it's make a more detailed rule book. I don't have a physical example anymore, but I distinctly remember buying Yu-Gi-Oh! Structure decks that came with a pretty detailed rule book that was only updated whenever they added a new core mechanic. And I think with Fab being such a complex game, this might actually be better than just a basic guide. You could go into more information about how card interactions work, how things like allies work, like not closing the chain to attack them, and anything else that could be useful for both brand new players and people who might have played for a bit but don't know every single rule. For example, despite the fact that I'd played for a few years, when Part the Mistveil came out, I started playing Enigma, but I didn't know at first that you could play one of your Transcend cards, hold priority, and play a second to transcend them both. I thought that a blue had to resolve first to be considered played, and it's little things like this that could be explained in a bit more detail with a rule book rather than a basic guide. And hey, LSS have already made something like this with the little lore book that came with the classic battles decks. Just take this booklet, have the first part of it being the basics of playing the game, and the second half being the more detailed rules. Put an index at the front or back so people can quickly find what rule they're looking for, and voila, a perfect guide. But whatever path LSS would choose, I do think that these guides should just be made generic and not tied to each deck exactly. I know I've mentioned this before about the Gravy guide, but you could just use things like Ira and Scar for Scar as reference cards, and then that one guide could just go in every deck. For example, the One Piece guide uses cards like Red Jinbei and Luffy that aren't even in the decks that I bought, but they're there to get the point across. Doing a more generic guide would allow LSS to put in development time once and only having to update it if there's a core rule or mechanic that's changed or added. Speaking of adding things, the other thing I think that Armory decks do worse is that they just come with the deck and nothing else. I was very pleasantly surprised when I opened up my first One Piece starter deck to find that they come with the booster pack from the set that they're tied to. In fact, this is something that a lot of other games do too, with even Magic's Commander decks now coming with sample packs that have 2 cards. Now, to be very fair to LSS, putting a pack in the Armory decks probably won't really work. While some, like Gravy and Pleiades, are tied to a set, most of the decks aren't. Of course, they could do something like gem packs, but again, if the hero wasn't tied to the set the gem packs are made for, it just won't really be relevant. And I did consider maybe they could do like Armory deck specific mini packs, but I feel like that would just be too difficult because like you'd have to make new ones for each deck. Like they could be mini pack that's got like a relevant rare or majestic reprint and maybe a foil of one of the new cards, but again, doing this for every different deck is just probably a logistical nightmare. And so I'd like to return to an idea I have shared before: acrylic resource counters. Listen, LSS is ultimately competing with other card game companies for the time and attention of players. And when your competition is including things like entire packs in their decks, then having nothing else in yours just feels a bit cheap by comparison. In fairness, LSS is a smaller company and most likely does not rake in as much cash as the bigger companies, meaning that adding things to the product might be a bit more difficult to do. That said, unfortunately, the average consumer just doesn't care. But having something simple like a resource counter that's made of acrylic and it's colored to match the theme of the deck would be a great way to just add that extra little goodie without adding a lot of cost. At least I think. To be fair, I'm not the one actually dealing with the companies that put these products together. Maybe it is a pain in the ass to include extra stuff, but considering Magic decks have had spin down dice in them for practically forever, I really do want to see something specific to Fab be added as an extra include. Again, I really do think Armory decks are a very solid product, but the One Piece starter decks having a solid how to play guide and an extra pack were really nice includes that made the entry into that game feel that much nicer. Of course, Armory decks are built better and you don't need to buy multiples, but I think that if LSS could just make those few tweaks to the product, they can really stand out as some of the best TCG precons, period. Of course, these are just my thoughts and feelings on the product, and I'm sure that many of you might have different opinions. These are just the things that really stuck out to me when I got the One Piece decks, and I wanted to quickly talk about it again because I believe the Armory decks are the single most important product for getting people to play Flesh and Blood. In fact, I think it's pretty obvious that this is the case considering how many of these LSS have been pumping out since their inception. We wouldn't have 3 more coming just this year if these were a flop. But that will be all for this video. Let me know what you all think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, and thanks to all the patrons. Huge shout out to the GigaChats Geeks first, Elixir, Vinny, John, Ty, Chemical, and Dark Memoria. Then we've got the Alpha Chads, Thomas, Zajima, and Approximo, and then there's the Super Chads, Cece, Ben, Yogbadoodles21, Kevin, and Wolf Shadowmancer. Thanks again as always, and stay Chadly, my friends. And sweaty. My goodness, it is hot in here.